Welcome to Singapore. Welcome to the city of crazy rich Asians. Welcome to the region of healthy and wealthy Asians. And most of all, welcome to what I consider to be the capital of Asia. That's a term I have been using to describe Singapore for a number of years now. Now, of course, Asia is so vast, so diverse, it does not have a single capital. But I consider it part of the wisdom of ILTM that in addition to their great and very well-attended China summit, that they've added this to the repertoire. And judging from the number of people who have turned out, there is a crystallization of the recognition that Asia is a lot bigger than just the China story. And what I'm going to do in the 19 minutes I have remaining is to give you a tour. And with apologies to Allison, this will not be 19 minutes of recharging. I'm going to make you focus like a laser. But that said, everything you learn in the next 19 minutes, you can have time off to absorb later on during your massage or during your yoga. So there are, the majority of the world population already today lives in Asia. More than 51% of the world population. Of those nearly 5 billion people who live in Asia, only 1.5 billion are in China, 1.4 to be exact. So even the largest country in the world cannot represent all of Asia itself. And I want to take you on a tour of this bewildering demographic, societal, economic story in that time. What's equally important about this image that's really worth a lot more than 1,000 words is that not only is Asia the center of the world population today, but that is always going to be true. Always. For the rest of our lives, your children's lives, and your grandchildren's lives. And I'll tell you why. 25 years ago, when we were doing global demographic forecasting, we thought the world population might reach 15 billion people. We were off by quite a bit. The world population is projected now to peak at under 10 billion people. Ergo, the majority is already here in Asia and that's going to be the place. So you really want to understand this geography as well as possible. It's going to be extremely consequential if it isn't already. So, a brief tour of the last 75 years of economic history in this region in 1 minute. The story of Asia's staggering rise to the center of the world economy actually begins right after World War II with Japan. In the ashes of World War II, Japan rose already by 1975 to be the world's second largest economy. At the time, you may remember, those who were around then, there was a concern in Western economies that it was Japan that represented the grave economic threat and commercial challenge to the dominance of the United States. Remember those days? The way we talk about China today, or many people talk about China today, is the way people talked about Japan. So there is an origin to this Asian economic story prior to China's rise. And indeed, that was just the first wave of Asia's modern economic growth. The Japanese story is what inspired the tiger economies, right? South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, with, of course, Hong Kong and Singapore having a considerable post-colonial boost and advantage. And their economies also rose, increasing exponentially in size in such a short period of time. That's the second wave of Asia's economic growth in recent decades. And then you get China. That's where China enters the story exactly 40 years ago. Exactly 40 years ago is when China's economic opening took place or began with the establishment of Shenzhen as China's first special economic zone. And who were the largest investors in China? Who had the faith to invest in the Chinese economic opening at the time? It was the countries that came before it in this story, right? It was Japan and the tigers. And to this day, they remain among the largest investors in China. So the story of Asia's economic rise is not one country or the other or one replacing the other. It is the story of these mutually reinforcing waves. So, is that the end of the story? Is China the beginning, the end of history? It's not, right? It's the third wave. And the fourth wave is the one that has just kicked off. And hence, here you are in Singapore, capital not only of Greater Asia, but most certainly the hub for the South and Southeast Asian belt of countries that are lit up in orange here, whose collective demographic size is about 10, 12 countries, whose combined population, look at the number there at the bottom, 2.5 billion people. Just those countries. Now, As it is, China is an enormous story, and it continues to grow, continues to, even at a slower rate of growth, it still is contributing more to global economic growth than any other country in the world. But if you look at these countries, every one of them in orange has a younger median age than China. All of them are younger than China. Almost all of them are growing faster than China. They're starting from a lower base. They're all obviously smaller economies. But from the year 2020 to 2030, according to Standard Chartered Bank, the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world of the next 10 years, China is actually not even on that list, whereas about 6 of these countries lit up in orange are on that list. Now, it's not one country, of course, but if these countries in orange grow at only half the rate that China has in the last several decades, they will equal China's current GDP, and it is the largest GDP in the world, in less than 10 years. This is the collective Asian story. So it's even bigger than just China. Let me show it to you in economic terms and frame it a bit differently from the conventional data that you see. Because there is a debate out there. When will China be the largest economy in the world? Will it be 2025? Will it be 2030? The answer is, it already happened a couple of years ago. The correct way to measure a country's economic size is in purchasing power parity terms. Look at what the people in the country pay for things that they consume in that country. And most things that Asians buy are made by Asians in Asian countries, and Asians pay Asian prices for those Asian things, right? So that's the way you should look at it. And that was a very colloquial way of explaining an economic concept to you, if you didn't know it already. So by that measurement, China is already the largest economy in the world. But what's important is that the other Asian economies that have tended to be neglected in our conversations about the region are substantially revised upward. They actually have more purchasing power, more consumption power, more people that are part of the consumer economy than we traditionally recognize. In other words, Asia is quite economically multipolar, just as the whole world is. And what you see if you add up all the Asian economies is, again, according to the latest research, within the next couple of years, Asia will represent 50%, 50, just as I showed you before. It's already half the world population, be half the world's GDP in purchasing power parity terms. And I want to transition now to talking a bit about what I call the Asian economic system, because as I said before, these 4 waves of growth have been mutually reinforcing. And now even the countries that have not traditionally been thought of as Asia. I mean, if I were to put up a blank screen or give you all a blank sheet of paper and say, draw Asia, your map that you would draw would pretty much be, China, Japan, and, a bit of Southeast Asia, right? But Asia, geographers don't disagree about what Asia is. It's much, much larger than that. And it even includes these other countries, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, that are traditionally considered West Asia, or even Russia, that is often categorized as Europe. But if you look at the trade and investment patterns for these West Asian or Northwest Asian countries, they're all being tied more and more to Asia. And I'm going to show you some of how that interconnectivity is happening. Some of the important things that make it important to appreciate just how much momentum is in this Asian story, I've put right here. And that is some of the lessons that have been learned in the last 20 years. This is, as I said, the 40th anniversary of China's economic opening. It's also the 20th anniversary of the Asian financial crisis, right? 1997, 1998, 99 was a terrible period in this region in particular. And Asian governments, regulators, central banks, finance ministries have spent the last 20 years learning the lessons and implementing some very important best practices in their economies that give me the confidence to make this forecast that I'm giving you. You have such high savings rates that these countries have amassed, not only government reserves, but household savings, that are now translating more and more into consumption. You have this rising wealth, of course, being spent in the consumer economy, and it becomes easier to do so because of the very rapid pace of financialization and digitization and urbanization. These 3 things, urbanization, financialization, digitization, are happening at the same time in tandem. What does that mean? It means that whereas we used to think that a country needed to have a per capita income in US dollar terms of $7,000 or $8,000 before it became a large-scale consumer society. Today you are seeing the poorest countries in Asia with incomes of $2,000, $3,000 have very widespread access to financial services, mobile banking, and so forth, right? And that is how Asian economies, even the poor ones, are leapfrogging and being customers that you can access. As I mentioned, some of the things that their governments are doing, they're able to borrow more in local currencies. That allows them to invest more in infrastructure. So you're seeing improvements in infrastructure across the board. The government spending as a share of GDP on improving infrastructure is improving rapidly as well. There's a lot of privatization going on in Asian economies, which means more opportunities to buy directly into some of the key sectors where you want to see reform and where you want to unlock growth and invest more. That includes retail, that includes hospitality, consumer goods, and so forth. So all of these are some of the important trends that are driving the next wave of growth forward. Now, here's why it's important to understand the greater Asian story. You can choose to focus on one country or a sub-region. You can be bringing travelers into Asia or taking travelers out of Asia, specific countries. But remember this, the largest movement of people in the world is Asians within Asia, right? Asians just moving within Asia. And a lot of it has to do, I won't go into a long history of British colonialism, but that's one of the reasons why. Another is just growing connectivity. Now, I'll go back in between the two anniversaries I just mentioned. 40 years ago with China, 20 years ago the financial crisis, 30 years ago. What happened 30 years ago this year? The Berlin Wall fell, right, 1989. And the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later, 1991. The countries on this map have spent the last 30 years resurrecting the Silk Roads, right? The pre-colonial patterns of interaction, of trade, have been coming back. You have seen infrastructure investment across those borders. You've seen trade liberalization, greater movement of people, liberalization of travel and investment and visa regimes. All of these things have been occurring in the last 30 years amongst the many countries on this map. And already by 15 years ago, countries in Asia were trading more with each other than with the rest of the world. So Asians literally trade more with each other than they do with the rest of the planet. And that's why 10 years ago, when the financial crisis happened, centered on Western economies, Asia continued to grow. And every single pair of countries that you see here in these trade volumes that reflects today's data, all of those trade volumes are growing every single year. Pick any pair, and you can go back 10 years, 5 years, and you can project forward, and you can see how much more trade is transpiring. The complementarities between Asian societies are remarkable. And it's also demographic. So as I said, Asians travel more within Asia. You have the demographics that I mentioned earlier. The countries towards the southern rim, South and Southeast Asia, are the younger ones, and the older countries are in North and Northeast Asia. So you're seeing greater demographic flows as well. That's being enabled by new transportation corridors. Now, I mentioned some of the infrastructure investment earlier. Just look at airports and aviation and the number of business travelers, students, tourists, of course, moving around in Asia. It's enabled by investment in airports, low-cost airlines, and the ease of travel. So all of the world's busiest international airline routes in the whole world are between Asian cities. Number 11 happens to be New York, Toronto, by the way. But the top 10 are here. They're centered on Dubai, centered on Hong Kong, and Singapore. And as we know, judging from the infrastructure investment patterns that we're seeing around the region, this will only increase. I've also been looking at a lot of it is short haul. I'm also looking at the medium haul corridors as well. And there, too, you see really promising growth. That brings me to the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure you've been hearing about. China convened the second Belt and Road Initiative Summit just a couple of weeks ago in Beijing. But really, this infrastructure investment that is helping Asian economies unlock their complementarities and trade more with each other and enabling more flows of business travelers and tourists between their economies has been going on again since the day the Soviet Union collapsed. I made this map because I've spent a lot of the last 20 years traveling around these countries. And remember, on this slide, how many people live on this slide? Right? Well over 5 billion people live within this rectangle. Just remember that. And every single one of these countries wants nothing more than to unlock its connectivity, especially the landlocked countries, the former Soviet republics as well as the post-colonial countries. They're desperate to have more connectivity with each other, to trade more with each other. And that's why you're seeing this enthusiastic support for these infrastructure programs. So I've been watching it for the last 20 years. It has it acquired a name, Belt and Road, just a couple of years ago. And I'll probably spend the next 20 years analyzing what these economies are doing to make this map come true. The colored lines that you see here are the railways, the pipelines, the electricity grids, the internet cables, all of that connectivity that's making it easier and easier and easier for people to move around. For me, it's really vindicating. I mean, countries that people ignored for the longest time, I now see popping up as, must visit in 2019, and I see Pakistan on the list. I'm like, never thought I'd see that, but there it is. Uzbekistan, a place I've been to a whole bunch of times that most people can't find. It's there in the middle. Are now places that are reforming their economies, opening up, and the Central Asian countries have passed something called the Silk Visa. That means increasingly visa-free access. I used to personally have to go and prostrate at embassies and pay $300 to get a visa. Now you can just show up. And the pragmatism, in keeping with what I was saying about their economic reforms, I see that across the region. I see government capacity improving. I see a strong focus and desire to attract foreign investment and to welcome visitors. All of those things. And it's not just China. What China has done is kicked off what I call an infrastructure arms race. And the winner in an infrastructure arms race, where not just China, but Japan and the United States and Europeans are all saying, let's build more connectivity. Let's invest there more. Let's get involved in project finance, right? Let's invest in sustainability. Let's help that country transition towards alternative and renewable energy. All countries are doing that. All the great powers are doing it. And guess who the winner is? It's the countries that are receiving that investment, right? It's the Philippines, it's Thailand, it's Indonesia, it's Pakistan, it's all of those countries. And so they are going to continue to build this connectivity to each other, and that's going to be good for them. Southeast Asia is one of the critical epicenters of this. Of the post-colonial regions of the world that are graduating from the geopolitical insecurity and the national rivalries among neighbors that have characterized a lot of geopolitics in the last 50, 60 years, this is a region that's starting to really move beyond that. And you can see it in the plans for their 2025 vision of joint investments with each other. It's even called the Connectivity Master Plan, and it involves a lot more cross-border infrastructure investment, easing of trade and flows of people. Already there is labor mobility in the region. All of those things are starting to transpire. And you can see already, again, with visa policy and with the tourism promotion and so forth that governments are undertaking, that they're very, very serious about having not only business travelers, but even entrepreneurs and long-term residents come and to build out that quality residential lifestyle kind of environment. And to do that, they have to think about the environmental cleanup. So you're seeing governments that are, temporarily closed resorts and so forth in order to make sure that they restructure them in sustainable ways, the way Thailand and the Philippines have also done. Last couple of points. Cities are obviously the economic engines of the region, and there too, you want people to be coming to Asia, and governors and mayors and federal governments want people to come and not say, oh, I went to city X and all I did was sit in traffic for 4 hours of the day, right? So they're working on that too. You see a lot more investments in public transportation, in bus rapid transit, and so forth. So one of the things that I look at, and there's a lot of data about this online, is how the subregions of Asia are improving the quality of life, the sustainability, the quality of air, decreasing congestion, all of those things to focus on the sustainability of their environment and therefore the experience for their own citizens and for visitors. And I urge you to follow that data as well. I'll make a final point. I have blurred the lines a little bit in what I was saying between just being the ecosystem for travelers versus those who make this place home. And like some of you in this room, I'm a sort of expat, right? I moved here about 5 or 6 years ago and have settled here, and I feel like, I can't imagine at this point living anywhere else but Asia. But I grew up as an Asian American. That's what we were called. Young people who immigrated to America and grew up, as immigrants. There was always a hyphenation, Asian American, not just American, but Asian American. But now that I'm here, and I feel like I'm permanently here, I think of myself as an American Asian, right? And if it were just me, I may not tell the story. But in the course of my research, I have found that I'm far from alone, right? If you take just America and the data set of expatriation out of the United States and people who made, the number has doubled in a very short amount of time. And I see that happening with other countries as well. So whether it is Singapore or Hong Kong or Bangkok or Jakarta and the various expat-centered cities, and there's a lot more than those that I list here, they are attracting long-term migrants. And it's not just older professionals. I'm seeing young entrepreneurs, people who are launching startups and so forth coming here, and they too are helping to transform the culture and to promote, in a way, the openness of these countries to the rest of the world. So that's yet another trend that's reinforcing this cultural openness of Asia. So I want to leave just by, coming back to the main theme. After all, we're talking about wellness. We're talking about, in a way, culture. And let's remember where some of the practices that are becoming hot and trendy today, whether it is vegetarianism, whether it is traditional Chinese medicine, whether it is yoga, a lot of what is so culturally prominent in the world today that we'll be celebrating here, it's appropriate that you come to Asia to do that because these are Asian ideas. They stem from Asian civilization. In my work and in my newest book, I really try to document the ways in which the world is actually Asianizing. There's no better way, of course, though, to appreciate that than to come right here to Asia. Come, travel, be here, and live it. So with that, I wish you a wonderful, wonderful session and conference, and thank you so much.